Governor Andrew Cuomo, a man who enjoyed endless complimentary news coverage and even an Emmy for his handling of the coronavirus pandemic, is now embroiled in some pretty major scandals. Aside from being accused of sexually harassing a former staffer of his, he is dealing with a scandal involving the fact that he lied to the people of New York about the number of people who died in nursing homes. Watch.
The U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn and the FBI are looking at the handling of data surrounding COVID-19 deaths in long-term care facilities in New York. This comes after a top aide to Governor Cuomo admitted to state lawmakers that his administration delayed the release of that nursing home information because they were concerned the Trump administration would turn it into a political football. It's not clear whether federal investigators are looking at Cuomo himself.
They should be looking at Cuomo himself. In fact, all of us should have been pretty aware of how awful Cuomo was even before this scandal broke out. Now, New Yorkers and the rest of the country were deceived into believing that there were actually 50% less deaths in New York's nursing homes than was actually the reality. And Cuomo and his administration was forced to admit that the overall number of coronavirus deaths in these nursing homes was closer to 15,000 rather than the 8,000 or 8,500 that they had previously disclosed. So in other words, let's just be very clear here. Andrew Cuomo covered up mass deaths in his state. So it is a big scandal. It should be a big scandal. And to make matters worse, and this needs to be emphasized, the deaths appear to have been preventable and were likely caused by decisions he made as governor, while lauding himself as, someone who believes in the science. He would really differentiate himself from Trump as if he was much better, much more competent at handling this pandemic. When seniors were still recovering from the coronavirus in hospitals, Cuomo issued a directive forcing nursing homes to allow patients who were still testing positive for coronavirus to be readmitted into these nursing homes. So obviously this led to a rapid spread of this virus, which of course elderly people are very vulnerable to. And part of the reason why he made that decision was because he had cut so much funding for hospitals in the state of New York over the past few decades that actually led to a lack of hospital beds necessary in order to treat the number of patients necessary during this pandemic. In fact, the Associated Press noted that more than 9,000 recovering coronavirus patients in New York State were released from hospitals into nursing homes early in the pandemic under this controversial directive that was scrapped amid justified criticism that it accelerated outbreaks. So the New York State Health Department initially lied, by the way, about those numbers as well, as was also reported by the Associated Press. The new number of 9,056 recovering patients sent to hundreds of nursing homes is now more than 40% higher than what the state health department previously disclosed. Okay, so that was followed by revelations that the governor hit up one of the Democratic state assemblymen to basically threaten to destroy his career if he didn't publicly defend Cuomo.
Kim, who's criticized Cuomo over a controversy involving nursing home deaths from COVID, says Cuomo threatened to destroy his career.
Berating, yelling, and threatening that I have to issue a statement that invalidated what I heard. He asked me to lie to cover up for his staff, and this was done in front of my family. He called me. My wife was right next to me. I was right about to bathe my kids, and it really just put my family and my wife into shock and trauma.
I mean, how did all those Cuomo-sexuals miss this? How did they not realize that Andrew Cuomo was this big bully, someone who would carry out the same actions that you would see, Governor Ron DeSantis from Florida do? Ron DeSantis tried to suppress coronavirus data, and it appears that Andrew Cuomo did the same thing. But no one was really paying close attention to Cuomo's wrongdoings in the beginning of the pandemic. I know that some New Yorkers certainly were aware of it, and maybe this comes as no surprise to them after they had lost their jobs and the healthcare benefits that come along with that employment. And then they lived through the experience and witnessed the horror of Andrew Cuomo cut billions of dollars in the state's Medicaid program as this virus was, leading to more and more bodies piling up outside of hospitals. That's what Cuomo was doing. That barely got any news coverage. Cuomo's Medicaid redesign team, MRT, released its proposals to cut $2.5 billion from the state Medicaid budget, including $400 million to hospitals as they battle coronavirus in the next year. As written in Jacobin, you should definitely check out this piece. The article continues to note, he continues to push to meet a budget shortfall by reenacting deep Medicaid cuts rather than passing wildly popular tax increases on the 0.01%, even though this would require him to turn down $6.7 billion in federal coronavirus aid to the state. So, in other words, the guy who forced nursing homes to readmit sick coronavirus patients to free up hospital beds is the same guy responsible for the lack of hospital beds in the first place. Sean Petty, for instance, of the New York State Nurses Association, told Democracy Now! That he believes Cuomo is probably the single most important person in terms of the drive to shut down or basically close down 20,000 hospital beds in the state. Let's hear more of what he had to say.
For instance, I would call Governor Cuomo probably the single most important person in terms of the drive to close down hospital beds in this state over the last 20 years. In New York State, we've gone from 73,000 beds to 53,000 beds from the year 2000 to the present time. So specifically because of policies that Governor Cuomo has pursued, we are now 20,000 beds behind where we need to be in terms of trying to scale up our capacity to these unprecedented levels. Governor Cuomo estimates, I think this week, that we need 140,000 hospital beds.
That interview didn't happen a week ago. That interview happened in the beginning of the pandemic or early on in the pandemic in March. And no one in the corporate media gave a damn. No one paid attention. In fact, the response to Andrew Cuomo and his fancy data regurgitations was applauded by the corporate media. Despite the austerity horror show that was taking place under his bungled leadership, Cuomo was hailed as a competent, capable, and credible leader. Social media was littered with hashtag President Cuomo because he became the heroic substitute to the uncouth circus that Trump starred in daily. That's what voters wanted, someone who would make them feel like everything was going to be okay, someone who would calm their nerves. Rolling Stone celebrated him, saying that Andrew Cuomo takes charge, the New York governor on leadership, hard truths, and what comes next. I mean, the subheadline in the feature was pretty bad as well, where they write, the governor of New York found himself at the center of a deadly crisis. His response has helped guide the nation. Remember, he's cutting billions of dollars in Medicaid as his own constituents are losing their jobs and the health care that comes along with it in the middle of this pandemic. And by the way, the tranquilizing nature of Cuomo's statistical regurgitations was exactly what Americans craved at that time. Something that was shallow, something that, was actually pretty toxic once you scratched the surface, but still had the ability to tranquilize Americans and give them a substitute to Trump's personality. And what stands out the most about this whole fiasco that's taking place is that, he really didn't serve as a real substitution when it comes to what people want ideologically in this country. So substantive ideological principles among parties is important. And what we're experiencing and what we've been experiencing for decades now is what a political scientist named Peter Mayer refers to as the cartelization of political parties, where they become incredibly similar because at the end of the day, their whole purpose is to serve the elites. And so we end up engaging in conversations regarding hero worship or cults of personality, as opposed to actual substantive ideological principles that bind us together. So while the corporate media pundits would have you believe that the political parties in the United States couldn't be more different, in reality, their core foundation is really similar. Parties are controlled by elites to serve the best interests of elites. And that's why, regardless of what constituents want, regardless of how popular something like a $15 an hour minimum wage is, doesn't even matter if red states are passing it through ballot initiatives, both parties on a federal level will fight against it as hard as they can. So political scientist Peter Mayer also wrote this: there is less and less choice in policy terms, suggesting that political competition is drifting toward an opposition of form rather than content. He wrote that in his book, The Challenge to Party Government. So how do parties really differentiate themselves? How is it that, we can see politics is so tribal in this country when we have two parties that are actually very similar when it comes to their foundation and who they're meant to serve? Well, Mayer also writes in Ruling the Void, competition between parties in these circumstances can be intense and hard fought, but it is often akin to the competition on show in football matches or horse races. Sharp, exciting, and even pleasing to the spectators, but ultimately lacking in substantive meaning. And I mean, we can certainly feel that. We can certainly see that when U.S. imperialism is still pursued by both parties. Doesn't even matter if it's Democrat or Republican. It's certainly the case when it comes to austerity measures. Really, the only differences we notice has to do with decorum, with personality, and whether or not we see politicians as heroes. And I think that's a problem. Mayer elaborates on it further in the next clip.
How do parties in these constrained and squeezed circumstances justify or legitimate their governance? How do you justify the fact that you as a party should be in government and should be leading the polity? What is it that gives you, as it were, the right and gives you the strength and gives you the credibility to run government? Government is about one thing, driven by forces largely beyond the control of parties, and elections are something else. That begs then other questions, which is that if elections are not about these issues, these core issues of government, what then are they about? And what then will they be about? Paraphrase Raymond Carver, what do we talk about when we talk about politics? We talk perhaps about something anodyne, like leadership and trust and so on and so forth, which is general and non-party specific. Or we talk about something maverick and particularistic, like local level politics, personalities, identities, and so on and so forth. Or, as Krast have also warned, we talk about something dangerous, and the parties talk about something dangerous. We talk about a populist politics which doesn't address key socio-economic policy areas, but instead talks of things like religion or ethnicity or values or whatever it might be, which are removed from the socio-economic concerns of government, but which can motivate elections and drive competition.
That talk was from 2011. I mean, Mayer was certainly ahead of his time, and his work is super relevant to what we're experiencing today. Anton Yeager also elaborated on this further in Damage magazine. I want to read you an excerpt from one of his pieces where he writes that the result of the infamous void described by the Irish political scientist Peter Mayer, demobilized citizenry forced to rely on the market for meaning and survival, only taking cues from the state as to how to maximize its competitive positioning. Collective agency was abdicated to globalization, and institutions were passé. In the 1990s, the majority of the left willfully participated in this shift, trading working classes for multitudes and the market for the network. And so, the fact that Americans are more and more atomized, the fact that, some of these important institutions, especially labor, have weakened, has basically led to, let's say, the Democratic Party being able to morph more and more into the party of the elites. And we're certainly seeing this in, their voter base as well. The fact that they're certainly more appealing to suburban white collar voters and less appealing to, working class Americans who traditionally saw the Democratic Party as at least trying to serve the best interests of workers. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore, especially based on how this fight for a $15 an hour minimum wage is playing out, which is incredibly frustrating. And so, just to go back to what the focus ends up being about regarding, elections and the discourse that takes place, inevitably voters delude themselves into thinking that there are significant differences between these parties, right? Now, it's based on shallow things like personality, and even though both parties still further imperialist foreign policy objectives and pursue endless austerity measures, you have people going into two different corners as if these two parties are just so different, fundamentally different. And look, my theory is that since political parties represent elites, it shouldn't be surprising that they would use manipulative tactics based on shallow characteristics in order to sell us things, right? To sell us their party and to make us feel good about the fact that we support their party. If you take a look at the fossil fuel industry and how they convinced Americans that it was totally fine for them to keep producing more and more plastic as it was polluting the world, the earth. They used manipulative tactics that focused on identity politics, that lied to Americans and made them think that what they were engaging in when they buy these products and then recycle them, makes them a good person. In reality, the vast majority of the plastics we recycle doesn't actually get recycled. But why is it that so many Americans think that it does? Well, it's because fossil fuel companies put out ads like this.
But when Americans were saving their plastic to reuse it, lobby groups just bought advertisements telling them, throw it out every time, we'll just make more plastic out of our unlimited, consequence-free supply of fossil fuels. And that's when plastics came up against their first big hurdle.
On April 22nd, 1 in every 10 Americans took part in rallies. The public outcry on that first Earth Day led to political action.
Well, that actually wasn't going to work for the plastics industry, but they had a compromise they felt would work for everybody. They'd lie. So the plastics industry, fossil fuel corporations, and a number of other companies formed a front group called Keep America Beautiful. They got an Italian guy, dressed him up like a Native American stereotype, and then shot this commercial.
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country, and some people don't. People start pollution. People can stop it.
I mean, yes, sure, they could have just easily made their products less disposable, but why do that when you can just spend a few $1 million on an advertisement to convince you it's your fault there's more trash everywhere? And it worked!
There are a lot of themes with that manipulative ad campaign that we can touch on. But what really stood out to me was the use of Native American identity in order to manipulate Americans to feel good about a product, to feel good about engaging in something. And we see very similar trends happening with the Democratic Party today, and also the Republican Party. I mean, America First is a part of the ideological branding that the Republican Party has engaged in to make you focus on things that actually don't improve your life in any substantive way. And also doesn't really differentiate the Republicans from the Democratic Party when it comes to actual substantive issues, including austerity. And so let me just end by saying that what we're also noticing right now as a result of this engagement in all of the different things that are sold to us in the void that's been created by these cartelized parties, it turns people into hypocrites in a lot of ways as well, because you find yourself, if you've engaged in this, having to make excuses for the very same actions that you criticized the other party for engaging in. So, for instance, Joe Biden just approved an airstrike in Syria. It's a continuation of the foreign policy that we saw with the Trump administration. Trump was a continuation of the foreign policy we saw in the Obama administration, and I can go on and on and on and on. So when the very people who were critical of Donald Trump for his foreign policy turn around and see that Joe Biden, someone they support, is engaging in the same thing, how do they explain that? Is that like a wake-up call for them? Do they realize that maybe they should understand that there are issues that they should hold both parties accountable for? Not for Amy Siskind, who tweeted this: "So different having military action under Biden, no middle school level threats on Twitter, trust Biden and his team's competence." In other words, dropping bombs is totally fine as long as the guy green-lighting dropping those bombs is polite, and as long as I like him. I didn't like the other guy. So this situation is different. And we see that play out in politics over and over again, Nando.
Yeah. It's first of all, that was a great segment. But the Andrew Cuomo thing is maybe the most perfect example of how rotten liberal culture is at its very core. I mean, Andrew Cuomo is an absolute monster. It's not like he's just a very self-evidently like an absolute monster. Like in so much,
he really is.
Both in any substantive way. I mean, thousands of bodies like in the ground because of him, thousands of bodies because of his disastrous decisions and corruption and malfeasance and all that stuff. Both in style, he's just an absolute monster in terms of style. I mean, he is not a nice person. He's an asshole. And they love him. They love him.
Mm-hmm.
They love him, folks. And again, I mean, we talked about this a little bit on TYT, but the mere presence of Andrew Cuomo is offensive to me in some way. I mean, his father was also governor of New York, and his brother is the anchor for the most important primetime news show on the most important cable news channel in the country. And
it's crazy.
It's crazy.
It's absolutely crazy.
That's some North Korea shit.
It is. No, and that's the amazing thing. Like the inability for so many people in this country from both parties, it doesn't even matter. Like their inability to just have a moment of self-reflection. There are so many conflicts of interest. Why are members of Congress allowed to invest in individual stocks? Do you guys understand how crazy that is? They make they write and pass policies or refuse to pass policies that would affect these very companies and their profit margin. Like what?
Yeah.
We live in an insane country when you really stop and think about it. And for us to judge how other countries are governed or how other leaders run their countries is ridiculous. It's just laughable.
Yeah. No, and the Peter Mayer clip is just it's the perfect distillation of what politics has become in the neoliberal era, right? I mean, it's just for people our age, people younger than us, it's very, very difficult to imagine a different world because we grew up in this world of politics purely as a spectator sport, right? I mean, he even compares it literally to a football match or a horse race, which is what the political press, by the way, calls political journalism. They call it horse race coverage.
Yeah.
Politics used to not be that way. Politics, I mean, for all its flaws in the 20th centuries, which there were many, it was still, even in this country, it did actually involve substantive issues about who gets what in our society. And now that's just, all those debates are quote unquote settled. The trajectory is the same, linear. It really does not matter who's in it. The broad trajectory of wages, of social outcomes, of all these big picture kind of indicators of the health of our society are linear, and it's just those questions are settled. They cannot be touched. Anyone who dares touch them is excommunicated. And it's about something else. It's about other things. It's about nonsense, really.
Yeah.
And again, that situation cannot last forever. Like, it cannot last forever. It will eventually change. It will eventually break. There will be some sort of rupture. But it could go on for many more years, like it could go on for, because again, the big picture, when you zoom out, like, they could go on for another decade, go on for another 20 years, sometimes these moments of kind of stasis and being stuck can go on longer than, for one person's lifetime, it could be our whole lives, for example. But yeah, it's just, I can't shake the feeling that we're just stuck. That there's just stuck.
Yeah.
We can't do anything. Nothing can be done. It's just
like, as you're talking about all this, like, I don't know if you've seen that movie Nomadland.
I haven't seen it yet.
It's okay. You should watch it.
I know
we
about
watched
it
it
though,
last
yeah.
night.
Yeah.
Probably not the best Friday night movie.
No.
But what really stood out to me about it, there's no spoilers or anything, but everyone knows, like, anyone who's seen an ad for it, it's about, people living in poverty. And it's partly about people living in poverty. It's a huge theme in the movie. People living out of trailers and things like that, out of their vans. And as I was watching that, you feel gutted. And the entire time I was like trying to hold back tears because I hate crying during movies. Like, I try to like hold it back. But as I was watching it, at one point I realized there wasn't a single moment where I questioned whether these people were politically aligned with me on social issues. Like, it didn't matter to me, because as you're watching that movie and seeing people live like that, you relate to them. They're people, they're humans, right? And no one on this planet should live like that. And we're talking about people living working full-time jobs, going to work at Amazon, working a full-time job and not having enough money to pay rent. That is so common in this country. Yeah. And you're right. There has to be a breaking point. Something's going to, cause a rupture. I don't know when it's going to happen, but
impossible to predict.
It is. It's really impossible. It's so frustrating.
Yeah, and those of us who kind of participate in politics in some way, we do it through the media. The only thing we can do is kind of prepare ourselves for when the break happens, and prepare as many people as we can by arming them with, information, ideology, the tools that they would need to sort of become active participants in a politics that kind of is revived. Because again, the other thing that is not guaranteed is that the rupture will lead to better outcomes. The rupture could lead to a much worse outcome. Like, things can always get worse. That's one of the sort of things that it's been ingrained in our life as Americans. Like, we've been beaten into our kind of programming since we were children, is that just kind of as time goes on, progress happens. We kind of all believe that in some way, but that's just not true. History is rife with examples of things getting way worse for a long time, right? It's not a linear progression in any sort of way. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen.
It's something that stands out to me a lot, actually, if I'm watching Sopranos, which was pre 9/11, or
started pre 9/11,
romanticizing. Yeah. Well, yeah, it started before 9/11, and then even just like thinking about, I told you on TYT, I've been romanticizing a lot. And I know there were issues in the country, don't get me wrong. I'm not like over romanticizing, but I was thinking a lot about the late 1960s and like how different America was culturally, how there was this emphasis on funding the arts. And, I live in Los Angeles. We both live in Los Angeles. Laurel Canyon was known for all of these classic rock artists getting together and jamming together. And it's just like, that sense of community, that sense of really appreciating art to the point where the federal government was funding it, all of that stuff has been like wiped away. And things can get worse in some aspects, especially when it comes to the security state and surveillance state, when it comes to defunding programs that actually enrich people's lives. In a lot of ways, the country has gotten worse, and I think it's really important to emphasize that for people.
Yeah.